Bedtime Reading. The Time Machine. Chapter 1. Sitting around the dinner table, a teacher, a doctor, a psychologist, and myself, all of us pleasantly full from the meal we had just finished and pleasantly relaxed from the wine we had been drinking, we listened to our host, the scientist, as he prepared to explain, with great excitement, a new idea he had come upon. Now that I have your attention, I'd like to ask that you open your minds a little to what I am about to tell you, for it will be most natural for you to think me a crazy fool when you hear it. And how is that any different from the way we think of you now, dear scientist? Joked Philby, the scientist's closest friend. Laughing, the scientist responded, Yes. But seriously, I'm afraid that I have come to the conclusion that many of the things we were taught in school were quite incorrect, especially mathematics. The laughing stopped, and Philby, who was a math teacher, spoke up. How can that be? Look at all the progress we've made in the world. We must be doing something right. But that is, of course, why our progress is so slow and limited, dear Philby, replied the scientist. Take, for example, a line. Here the scientist took a notepad from his pocket and began to draw as he spoke. A line is measured by its length, yes? Are you trying to insult our intelligence? Asked Manning, the doctor. We studied this in high school geometry. Please have patience. To make my point, I must start with the most basic mathematical laws. Continuing, the scientist said, Now, if we draw 3 more lines, we then make a square, which we can measure not only by its length, but its width as well. He lifted the paper and showed the men his drawing. Then, turning to Philby, he asked, Could you hand me that box of cards, please? With pleasure, sir, said Philby, smiling and pushing the box toward the scientist. Now, this is also a square, but it can be measured by its depth. Yes. Could you please get to the point? Interrupted the doctor impatiently. The point is this. It seems our math teachers all believe that space is measured according to just those 3 basic dimensions: height, width, and depth. However, they are mistaken here, for there is a 4th dimension. And what dimension would that be? Asked Philby, now seeming a little uncomfortable. Why, time, of course. The whole room remained silent. After giving the gentlemen a few moments to think about this, the scientist continued by pointing to 3 paintings leaning against the wall behind him. They were pictures of a man at different stages in his life. Just look at these pictures. Here, the fellow is 8. In the next, he is 15. And in the last, he is 21. That is the 4th dimension being expressed by the other 3 dimensions. Do you understand? I then felt the need to speak. I think I do. However, I see a problem. Space is something in which we should be able to move. We can move about in the other dimensions of space. We can walk forward, backward, side to side, and we can jump up and down. We cannot, however, move in time. We must always remain in the present. Very good. But if you consider how impossible it must have seemed to people not very long ago, that man should be able to fly up into the air in a balloon, why should it be so impossible to imagine all the other possibilities, including movement through time? "Because it is crazy," cried out Philby. "Why is it crazy?" asked the scientist. "Look, even if you could somehow show that 2 plus 2 equals 5, I still wouldn't believe it." "I'm afraid that would be too difficult for me to prove. But I can prove the possibility of time travel. I've been performing experiments. Would you like to see the results?" "Experiments, ha!" laughed the doctor. "Please, oh please, scientist, I beg you, share with us your wonderful discovery." The scientist smiled at this, and with his hands in his pockets, he left the room and walked slowly down the hall towards his laboratory, leaving the three of us alone in the dining room. The doctor lit another cigar and said, "This must be some kind of joke. Remember last Christmas when he somehow made that spirit appear before us? I don't know how he did it, of course, but these scientists are all very clever and much too eager for fame and fortune. They love to show off their intelligence by tricking us into believing in their grand ideas." No one else said anything, for the scientist was just then returning to the room. In his hands he held a small metal object, no larger than an alarm clock. It looked very fragile because of all the small instruments inside. He set it carefully on the table and moved a lamp closer so that we could see it more clearly. "This is a model of a machine I am building. I spent 2 years planning and putting it together." "Well, it's certainly well made." "Very lovely indeed," said Philby. "This machine will make it possible for me to travel through time. Look here, this is where the passenger sits and operates the machine. Do you see this lever inside? Pushing this will send me forward into the future, however far I desire. And by pulling back that other lever, I can travel into the past. Now, doctor, would you be so kind as to give me your hand?" "What do you plan to do?" asked the doctor, a little frightened. "I'm going to let you pull one of the levers and send this model into another time. But first, I want all of you to take a very close look at it. I want there to be no question about the reality of this machine and its abilities. I'm not playing any tricks on you. I'm showing you this model at great cost, for once this machine is gone, I will never be able to get it back." Giving the men time to examine the machine and its surroundings, the scientist again addressed the doctor. "Now, please, sir, your hand." Taking the doctor's hand in his, he guided it toward the machine. "You needn't be so gentle. The levers are quite strong." The doctor's finger slowly pushed one of the levers forward. The machine then started to turn round and round, faster and faster, until it became unclear to the eye. Moments later, it disappeared, leaving only the lamp on the table. Silence followed, until Philby said to himself, "Well, look at that." I began to search about the room and under the table for any signs of the machine. Meanwhile, the doctor, having dropped his cigar, tried to light a new one with his shaking hands. The scientist, smiling proudly, said, "Well, what do you think of it, gentlemen?" "Was that some kind of trick? Do you really believe that machine is now traveling in time as we speak?" asked the doctor. "Of course it is. However, I could not see which lever you moved. so I'm not sure whether it is going forward or backward in time." "It must be going backward," said Philby. "And why do you say that?" asked the scientist. "Because if it were moving forward into the future, we should still be able to see it. But if it were moving into the past, we should have seen it during our dinner or last week when we met here for drinks," I pointed out. The scientist was excited to see us taking the machine so seriously. Smiling, he said, "Actually, gentlemen, it's quite simple. Think of a gun, for example. When someone shoots it, can we see the bullet as it flies through the air? Of course not. My time machine is no different. Because of the great speed at which it is traveling, it cannot be seen until it stops traveling, and then it can only be seen at the time and place at which it is stopped." Well, it seems believable now, after several glasses of wine, but we'll see how believable it is tomorrow morning when I wake up. Gentlemen, I assure you this has not been a trick of any kind," said the scientist very seriously. "Would you like to see the real machine?" Picking up the lamp, he began walking back into the hallway, saying, "You'll have to come with me to my laboratory this time. The machine is much too large to bring in here." We followed him down the long hallway and into the large room that was his work area. Everywhere were scientific instruments and glass containers bubbling with different colored liquids. Leading us to the rear of the room, he pulled back a large curtain, revealing a larger version of the model we had just seen disappear. It looked like it was almost finished. "All that I have left to do is attach those things over there, and my machine will be ready for travel," he said, pointing to his work table, on which lay two very large curved pieces of metal. "Please tell me that this is some kind of joke," said the doctor. "This machine that you see here is my life's work. If you cannot take this seriously, you can never take me seriously. So I beg of you, please stop looking for a trick in all this," answered the scientist. All of us stood there staring at the wonderful machine before us. None of us knew what to think of it. We all respected and admired the scientist, but this was something too impossible to believe. I looked over at Philby, who knew the scientist better than any of us, and was surprised to see him smiling. He turned to me and started to shake his head, saying softly, "What if he really has done it? What if this is all for real? Think about it." "Do you actually plan to risk your life in that thing?" asked the doctor. The scientist, closing the curtain, replied, "What would be the point of building it if I didn't intend to carry out the experiment?" Chapter 2. All that week I thought about the scientist's time machine. I wanted to believe in its truth, but I found myself remembering the doctor's words that evening about how these kinds of scientists could not be trusted. None of us spoke of time travel for the entire week. However, I'm sure that, like myself, the others must have been wondering about that disappearing model and the possibilities it offered if the larger machine could do the same. One evening, I happened to meet Dr. Manning at a bar downtown. We only spoke for a short time, for the doctor was meeting some friends for dinner soon after. "I can't say that I'm too impressed," said the doctor. "I've seen similar tricks performed before. It's not exactly clear how they do it, but I'm pretty sure it has something to do with the lighting of the room." "Well, however he did it, I was very deeply impressed," I said. It seems I'm going to have an opportunity to ask him more about it next Thursday, for he's invited me over for dinner that evening." "Ah, good. I'll see you there, as I have also been invited. We'll see what other tricks the good scientist has to show us." The following Thursday, I arrived a little late to the scientist's home. Upon entering the dining room, I found 5 men already seated. Dr. Manning was there, and so was Dr. Perry, the psychologist. The 3 new additions to our party were Blank, a famous newspaper editor, a journalist whose name I never learned, and a quiet, bearded gentleman who was quite forgettable because he hardly spoke the entire evening. Strangely enough, the scientist was not present. When I asked where he might be, the doctor said that he had left a note indicating that he was going to be late for dinner, and that if he had not arrived by 7 o'clock, we should begin our meal without him. "Where could he be?" wondered Blank. "Oh, he's probably out traveling about through time," I joked. At this, both Doctors Manning and Perry laughed quite hard. Blank and the others, however, were confused and asked that we explain the joke. Dr. Manning then began to tell them about last week's trick. As he was telling the story, I noticed the dining room doors beginning to open. Seeing in the darkness of the hallway the face of the scientist, I shouted, "Hello there! It's about time you showed up." Everyone turned to greet him as he entered. But when the scientist stepped into the light of the dining room, we were all astonished into silence. He looked horrible. His coat was covered in dirt, and down each of his arms was a deep green stain. His hair was a mess, and it looked grayer than before. Whether because it was so dirty or because it had somehow turned lighter, I could not say. His face was extremely white, and he had a deep cut on his chin that looked as though it had been healing for a while. He said nothing, but walked slowly and with some difficulty toward the dining table. Once there, he pointed toward the wine bottle. The editor poured him a glass and handed it to him. The scientist emptied the glass at once and then stood looking around the table with a strange smile on his face. "What in the hell have you been doing, man?" asked Manning. The scientist pushed his glass toward the editor again, indicating he wanted another drink, and watching the editor refill it, he spoke in a tired voice. "Gentlemen, I'm sorry to have frightened you. I promise to tell you everything. But first I must go wash up a little. Please, begin your meal, and be sure to leave me some of that mutton. I'm so very hungry." Watching him walk out of the room, I was surprised to find that he was wearing only a pair of socks, both covered in blood. I wanted to rush over to help, but I knew that would just annoy him. The 6 of us then sat in silence for a few moments until the editor held up both his hands and, as if reading, shouted, "Scientist goes mad! I can just see the headline in the newspapers tomorrow." The journalist laughed with him and added, "So, what has been going on here? This is hardly professional behavior." "It must have something to do with his experiments in time travel," I said. "Oh, come on," objected the editor. "All this talk about time travel is ridiculous. Look at how dirty he was. Don't you think that they would have a way to clean clothing in the future?" And for the next 10 minutes, the editor and journalist continued to make jokes of this sort about the scientist and his wild ideas. Neither of them seemed troubled by the scientist's horrible condition. I doubt that they had even noticed his pained walking and his bloody feet. They were still carrying on when the scientist finally returned to the dining room. "I say, man, these gentlemen tell us you've been traveling into the future," remarked the journalist with a smile. "Could you do me a favor and tell me the news for the next week, so that I can write the story ahead of time?" Again, the two newspaper men began to laugh at the scientist's expense. "Very funny indeed," said the scientist, not looking at anyone, but rather at all the food on the table. "Could someone pass me the mutton? I'm starving." "Well, aren't you going to explain yourself?" asked Dr. Manning. The scientist did not bother to answer, for he was quickly stuffing food into his mouth, as though he had not eaten since our last meeting. For 20 minutes we sat there in an uncomfortable silence, waiting for the scientist to finish his meal. Finally, laying down his fork and knife on the empty plate before him, the scientist leaned back in his chair, took a cigar from his pocket, and while cutting the end of it, said, "I really must apologize, gentlemen. You simply cannot imagine how hungry I just was. But let us move to the smoking room, where I can then tell you the whole story of my adventure." We all rose from our seats and followed the scientist to the next room. Then, positioning our chairs in a half-circle around his, we prepared ourselves for what he promised would be a long but exciting account of the past week. "Now, before I begin, have any of you who were here last week told these three fellows about my time machine?" "Yes, but I cannot say we did a very good job in the telling. There are still so many things that we are not clear about," I answered. "No matter how well it might or might not have been told, there's no way for me to believe that you have discovered a way to travel through time," said the editor. "Naturally," said the scientist. "Well, then, I would like to ask that no one interrupt me, because I have, in fact, just traveled through time, and I want to tell you everything while it is still fresh in my mind. There will be no arguing tonight, even though much of what I tell you I'm sure you will find unbelievable. That I cannot help. I am extremely tired, so please let me tell everything, for the sooner I tell it, the sooner I can go to bed. Is it agreed?" And after each of us had agreed, he began his incredible story. Chapter 3. As the three of you might remember, when I showed you my time machine last week, it was nearly finished. Unfortunately, the following day I realized that one of the metal pieces I needed to attach was too short, and so it had to be remade. This delayed my experiment nearly a week, so it was not until this morning that I had the opportunity to test it. So, at 10 o'clock this morning, I finished with all of my preparations and set myself inside the machine. I placed my hands over both the start and stop buttons. Like a man about to shoot himself with a gun, I sat there wondering what would happen once I took the next step. Feeling a moment of bravery, I pressed the start button and then immediately stopped the machine. During the few seconds the time machine was on, I had a dreamlike feeling that I was falling. Looking at the laboratory, nothing seemed to have changed. But then I caught sight of the wall clock. It now read 3:30. I had just traveled 6.5 hours into the future. Feeling extremely excited, I grabbed hold of the start lever with both hands and pushed it forward as far as I could. Again, I had the feeling that I was falling. Then I saw my cleaning woman come into the laboratory at great speed. She did not seem to notice me there. She cleaned the entire room in just seconds and was gone again. The days were passing faster and faster, day, night, like someone was repeatedly switching the room lights on and off. But as the machine increased its speed, the days started changing so fast that darkness and light, night and day, became one, turning the sky to a constant dark blue. But then a fear came over me of how fast I was moving. It seemed that at any moment I could run into something and be destroyed. I became worried and thought about stopping the machine, but then this was quickly forgotten, for I saw my laboratory disappear before my eyes. I guessed that it must have been torn down. All around me, tall buildings began to appear and disappear, growing larger and larger with each new construction. I could tell by the changing of the seasons that I was traveling more than a year per minute. My mind was very unclear. I was becoming very tired and even a little mad. I felt that I might never stop the machine from running for fear of what I might find. But then, seeing how beautiful the world looked, the strong desire returned to stop and explore. However, this was a dangerous matter, because if I stopped in the same place as another object in the future, I could cause a terrible explosion. I had thought about this before while I was building the machine, but I eventually accepted this as just a risk of scientific exploration. Immediately, I pulled back the stopping lever. The sudden stop threw me forward out of the machine. I landed several meters away and found myself out in the middle of a terrible rainstorm. It was good to no longer be moving. My head was becoming clearer every second. Picking myself up off the ground, my clothes becoming wet and heavy from the rain, I took a good look around. I seemed to be in the middle of a beautiful little garden, full of purple and yellow flowers. Over the right wall of the garden, I could see a huge statue. It looked like a bird with a man's head. Seeing this figure, my fear suddenly returned. Are there any people living now? If there are, what kind of people are they? Might they be cruel? Might they see me as something ancient and horrible? And for this, might they just kill me? I turned back to my time machine and found that it had fallen over on its side. I ran over to it and with all my strength tried to push it upright. The machine was heavy, but my fear was so great that I could not be discouraged. While struggling with this, the rain suddenly stopped, and with one final cry, I managed to turn the machine back over, but not without getting cut on the chin. Feeling tired, but encouraged by my success with the machine, I began to climb back inside in preparation for travel again. But before doing anything further, I took another good look around. Strange and wonderfully large buildings could be seen all around me. Even further in the distance was a dark forest. Now that the rain had stopped, a very peaceful feeling came over the place, and my fear began to calm. Then, from one side of the garden walls, I could hear voices approaching. From the other side, where the statue stood, I could now see men running toward me. Suddenly, in the garden entrance appeared one of these men. He was short, maybe only a little more than 1 meter in height. He was wearing a long purple gown with a belt tied at the center. On his feet he wore sandals. His hair was long and his face was smooth, and actually quite strangely beautiful, but his body was very thin and weak-looking, so much so that it seemed any amount of harm could be done to him by even the gentlest bit of contact. I decided to take a chance and approach him, but before I could, I found that he was already coming toward me. Chapter 4. The little man seemed not to be afraid, for he walked right up to me without hesitation, and by his laughter, while Looking me up and down, I guessed that he found me quite amusing. Several others came in behind him. He turned to them and, pointing to me, began speaking in a beautiful language I could not recognize. Soon I had about 8 or 9 of these men standing around me, touching my hands, my hair, and my clothing, all the while speaking to one another in their unique language. Throughout this I felt absolutely no fear at all. I found nothing threatening in these little people. Even if they had wanted to hurt me, I was certain that I could easily have defended myself. However, when they began to touch the time machine, I made a loud noise to frighten them away. Then, climbing back into it, I removed the 2 start and stop levers and placed them both in my pocket. Joining them again, I began to take greater notice of their features. They all had curly hair that flowed down around tiny ears, ending at the neck. As for their faces, they were rather pointed at the chin, and they possessed thin, red mouths around which no hair grew at all. I then tried to communicate with them directly by pointing to myself and to the time machine. Seeing that they did not understand, I tried pointing to the sun to indicate time. One of them suddenly got excited and, with his voice, made the sound of a loud thunder. It was then that I realized I might be dealing with people much less intelligent than myself. My heart sank with disappointment. I had always imagined the people of the future being so much cleverer than the people of my own time period. And now, here I was, 802,701 years into the future, meeting people who believed I was a god of some sort, come from the sky during a storm. One of them approached me, offering a necklace of flowers to wear. The flowers were quite uncommon and more beautiful than any I had ever seen. The others must have thought they looked good on me, for they then gathered up more flowers and started to throw them all around me, laughing and talking to one another all the while. I was then led away to a huge building made of stone. Inside was a great hall with large stone tables and tall windows of many different colors. On the tables were bowls of fresh fruit, mostly unfamiliar to me. Everyone gathered around the tables and, sitting on thick pillows, began to eat. I was encouraged to do the same. First, however, I wanted to observe their manners. I found them quite easy to learn, for they had none. Each person would take whatever he wanted from the table without asking. Even if it was the last piece of fruit on the plate, whoever grabbed it was the person who ate it. There were no special privileges for the women or children. Everyone was equal at this table. In terms of cleanliness, people simply threw or spit the unwanted parts of the fruit into a hole in the center of the table. Feeling quite hungry, I started into the food right away. After a while, I began to wonder when the actual meal was going to be served. Every time we finished a bowl of fruit, a new one, filled to the top, was brought to the table. However, soon I was disappointed to realize that these people ate no meat at all. Feeling that I was rather welcome now, I decided to try to learn as much of their language as I could. So, while eating, I began to point at the different fruits and made a question sound. At first, they did not know what I wanted, and instead of speaking, brought me an extra bowl of the fruit I was pointing to. Waving them away, I again pointed to the fruit. This time, a woman in the crowd started to speak to me. She repeated the same words several times, so I knew she was telling me the name of the fruit. In trying to repeat her words, I must have done a very poor job, for everyone began to laugh very hard. But eventually, I seemed to say it correctly. After a while, and with much difficulty, I learned all the names of the fruits at the table. However, when I tried to persuade them to teach me more, I saw that they had quickly grown tired of this. So I decided to give them a rest and ask them at a later time. A very strange characteristic of these people was their tendency to show great interest in me for only a moment, and then very suddenly lose all interest and walk away as if I were not there. I was not sure how to understand it. Were they disappointed in me? Was there something they expected me to do? I hoped that in time I might understand this better, or at least get used to it, for it made me very uncomfortable. After dinner, I decided that it would be a good idea to learn about the land around me. So I walked to the top of the highest hill in the area to have a look. Up there lay an ancient ruined building, slowly being destroyed by nature, which increasingly covered it in all sorts of plants and small trees. It looked a little dangerous to enter. Some parts of the roof seemed ready to fall at any moment from the slightest movement or vibration. Little did I know this would be the location of a very important event to take place later during my stay in this land. On the northern side of the building, I found a yellow rock that was shaped like a seat. Sitting there, I found it an ideal place to view the wide countryside below. One of the first things I noticed was that there were no houses or individual homes. All that could be seen were large palace-like buildings where the people appeared to live all together. The land was completely undeveloped. No farms could be seen in the distance, no parks, just wilderness, with the occasional huge steel or stone building coming up through the trees. This was indeed very different from the England I knew. On my way back to town, I found that several of their people had followed me during my journey. I joined them and, walking together, suddenly noticed that there was very little difference between the appearance of the men and the women. They wore the same type of clothing, all the same color. Even their bodies were very similar. I felt at the time that this must have changed due to the peaceful nature of their lives. Warring people tend to require greater differences between men and women, but these people seem to have no violence in their character at all. So I understood this to be an indication that man had finally won the battle with nature. Disease, crime, competition no longer appeared to be a problem. All of the discomforts of the world were gotten rid of. Now people were living very simple lives. And with such simplicity, things like strength and intelligence were no longer necessary. In fact, necessity itself had completely disappeared. And this, I believed, was the truth about these people and their world. I was surprised to have, in such a short time of being there, so easily uncovered everything there was to know. But soon, my ideas about this world would completely change. Chapter 5. As the sun began to disappear, the cold of night started to fall upon the earth. Walking back toward the village, I noticed how quiet and lonely the land had suddenly become. Not a single person could be seen anywhere. Looking for the main hall, I caught sight of the large bird-man statue. Following its eyes, I spotted the little garden area that I had found myself in when I first arrived in my time machine. But then I thought to myself that I had made a mistake, for I could not see my machine anywhere. However, after entering the garden, I found that it was the same place, as there was an outline in the grass where my machine had once stood. Immediately, A terrible fear took hold of me. What if I could never return to my own time? What if I had to stay here for the rest of my life? The need to run suddenly hit me, and I started off running harder than I had ever run before. Not knowing where else to go, I headed toward the statue. The idea that the people of the village had just moved my machine to a safer location kept running through my mind. But I knew that their limited intelligence would not allow for them to act so considerately. I found some comfort, but only very little, in the fact that I knew the machine was at least still in the same time as myself, for I had removed the 2 levers that would start the machine running again. I also knew that it could not be too far, for these people did not seem to have any other methods of transportation than their feet. Looking back on that moment, I think I must have gone crazy for a short time. I remember running around the base of the statue and looking under the surrounding bushes and trees. Having failed to find the machine, I started beating the trees with my fists until my hands were covered in blood. Realizing that I was not getting anywhere, I then ran to the main hall where I had dined earlier. Upon entering it, I fell over one of the dinner tables, nearly breaking my leg. It was very dark and quiet inside, so I took a match from my pocket and struck it against the floor. No one was in the dining hall, so I walked further into the building. Upon entering the next great room, I found several people sleeping on large pillows. I started to yell out to them, "What have you done with my time machine?" I realize now what a frightening sight I must have been for them, standing there in the dark with my little match, shouting at them in a strange language. They crowded around me, some laughing, some looking confused. I knew that talking with them would be useless, so I blew out the match and ran out of the room, knocking one of them over as I did. Behind me, I could hear them crying out in fear and running about the room. My memory of the rest of that night is not very clear, for I was completely out of control. I remember screaming at the moon, the trees, the earth, and blaming God for my horrible situation. I know that I became very tired at one point and ended up at the base of that statue again, crying like a little child, feeling hopelessly lost in a strange world I did not belong in. The following morning, I awoke to birds singing in bright sunshine. At first, I could not understand the sad feeling I had in me, so wonderful everything around me seemed to be. But then my situation once again became clear. Standing up, I decided to look at things in both the best and worst way. Yes, it seemed I was now trapped in this strange world, possibly forever. But I knew that I could survive, for I was with gentle people who could teach me their simple way of life. Then, maybe, after familiarizing myself with this world, I could one day build another machine and travel back to my own time. However, it was most likely that my machine had just been taken away somewhere out of my reach. Now, it was just a matter of remaining calm and searching for it. So, with my madness behind me, I made finding a place to bathe my first task of the day. As I looked about, I decided to check the garden area again for any information that might help me to locate my machine. Once there, I ran into some people and felt the need to try and question them a little. But as hard as I tried, they could not understand my words or gestures. I soon gave up and started looking at the ground where my machine had been. I saw strange footprints in the grass there. Following them, I found that they made a path toward the base of the statue. I carefully examined the structure of the base, but could find no doors. However, I guessed that there must be some way of getting inside, for the footprints clearly stopped here. I knew my machine had to be in there. Noticing some people coming from the nearby woods, I approached them and, as best I could, tried to express my desire to open the base of the statue. They looked at me as though I had just insulted them and quickly walked away. A little confused by this, I put my question to another friendly-looking man. He gave me the same look and again started to walk away from me. Losing all of my patience and not knowing what else to do, I grabbed hold of him and started to pull him toward the base. However, seeing the fear increasing on his face, I let go of him and watched as he ran off out of sight. I did not give up. I then began to beat against the base with my hands. Then, thinking better of it, I found a large rock, and raising it high up into the air, I started to work again on the walls. The people of the village grouped together in the distance and watched. After a while I became tired. Sitting down to rest, I started to realize the uselessness of what I was doing. I remembered my plan from early this morning, to accept my circumstances and to learn from them. Having once again come to this conclusion, I started to see the humor of my situation. Here I was, after successfully achieving my lifelong dream of time travel, now wishing to be nowhere else but safely back in my laboratory. Thinking this, I then began to laugh uncontrollably until I had tears in my eyes. Right away, I began to notice that people were now trying to avoid me for some reason. I guessed that it must have been because of the way I had been hitting the base of the statue. That really seemed to frighten them all, but I could not understand why. Over the next couple of days, I pretended that I did not notice anything wrong and spent most of my time alone, only trying to communicate with others when necessary. This worked well, for soon they appeared to have forgotten it all and began to interact with me more and more like before. I made it a point to study their language as best I could. Although I was unable to speak it very well, I found that their method of communication was quite basic. Much like the rest of their life, their language had been extremely simplified and necessitated only the use of verbs and nouns. Their longest sentences were maybe only 3 or 4 words in length. Regarding my time machine, although I was naturally worried about it, I decided to try and keep it in the back of my mind so that I could concentrate all my energy on living happily among these people. In this way, I felt that it would be most possible to one day get my machine back. Exploring the land more and more, I found that everywhere I looked, there were the same forests and the same huge buildings. No matter where I went, there was beauty and peace. The earth had truly become wonderful in the way that men of our time period can only dream about. One thing, however, I was very confused by. Every now and then, I would come upon a very deep hole in the ground, the top edge of which was surrounded in bronze, and it looked as though the walls of the hole might be covered in bronze as well, all the way down to the bottom. At first I thought that maybe this was for water or maybe for power, because when I became very silent, I could hear deep inside a strange mechanical sound. Taking a small piece of paper from my notebook, I tore it into little pieces and one by one began to drop them into the hole. To my surprise, they did not fall slowly, as I had imagined, but quickly disappeared as if being sucked in by something at the bottom. There were other confusing things I discovered as well. For example, I never once found a cemetery or crematorium where they might burn the bodies of their dead. I thought that maybe they might be located somewhere much further away than the places I had so far visited. But then I was even further surprised to find among these people neither the elderly nor the disabled. Where had they gone, I wondered. To add to my confusion, it came to my attention that there was no machinery among the palaces and other buildings. No one appeared to work or have any sort of job. From what I could tell, everyone seemed to do the same thing all day, every day: eat, play, and sleep. Surely they must have some way of making their fine gowns and sandals. But there were no stores or factories to be seen anywhere, nor did I ever see any traders coming or going. Who planted and gathered the fruit? Who made the clothing? Who designed and built these buildings? Where were the doctors? All of these questions, no matter how hard I thought about it, I could not come up with a good answer. One day I managed to make a friend. Early in the morning, sitting by a river, where some people were bathing, I saw a woman slip on a wet rock and fall into a deeper part of the water. She was not a good swimmer, and the river started carrying her away. Surprisingly, none of the other people there did anything to help her. They just continued to wash themselves as if nothing had happened. I quickly jumped to my feet and ran into the water, downstream from where she was. I could feel the strength of the water increasing as I moved further toward the middle. The young woman was just about to be swept past me when I quickly grabbed hold of her arm and pulled her with all my strength toward me. I carried her out of the river and laid her down on land. She was unconscious, but after I rubbed her arms and legs a few minutes, she reawakened. Seeing how quickly and easily her people lost interest in me, I expected no thanks from her. But when I ran into her later that day, she seemed very happy to see me and gave me a ring of flowers she must have made for me soon after the incident. I was very moved and did my best to thank her in return. We then sat down among some trees and had a wonderful time smiling at each other and playing childish games. She told me that her name was Weena, and so began a friendship that would, sadly, only last 1 week. From then on, Weena would try to follow me wherever I went. It seemed as though being away from me for even the shortest amount of time was very painful to her. And when I would be out exploring and she would fall behind from weakness and began to call out to me, I felt bad to leave her there. She seemed to be suffering so much, but I felt it was necessary to ignore her and continue to try and learn as much as I could about this place. I told myself that, just as in my own time, I had to be free from women in order to successfully practice my science. However, I wish that I had known then how much I had meant to her and how much she had really meant to me. For, in her own simple way, by following me around, or by waiting for me to return from my journeys just outside the village, she almost made this new place feel like home. In getting to know her better, I found that she was quite a brave person. In the daytime, nothing seemed to frighten her. She would climb the highest rocks with me and walk back to the village alone through the dense forest if we became separated. But night and darkness had quite a different effect on her. She was terribly fearful after the sun went down and would jump at the smallest sounds she heard. Then it occurred to me that all of the people of the village were similarly afraid. As soon as night fell upon the village, no one could ever be found outside. I also noticed that when they slept, they would always sleep in large groups, deep within the huge buildings they had for homes. I was too stupid to realize the reason for this, and I would cruelly insist that Weena and I sleep separate from the rest. This made her uncomfortable, but her love for me seemed strong enough to overcome her fears, and for the next 3 nights we slept peacefully together. However, after the 4th night, I woke up from a terrible dream in which I was drowning in the ocean and being pulled deeper and deeper into the water by the plants below. And when I awoke, though my mind was unclear, I thought that I saw a gray-colored animal hurrying out of the room. I decided to get up and have a look around to make sure it was nothing. Walking outside, I found the moon and sun greeting each other as the former set and the latter rose. The light at this time of day was such that everything seemed to cast strange shadows. Looking out at the distant hills, I could see groups of some sort of white animal carrying what looked like a body. They were running, and as I followed them with my eyes, I was surprised to see them suddenly disappear into the trees. Of course, this was so early in the morning that I did not feel I could trust my eyes. And in the next few minutes, the sun started to shine brighter and brighter, removing that strange light of half-night from my memory. Therefore, even though all day I could not stop thinking about what I had seen, I did not take it as seriously as I should have. The next morning, I was looking for shelter from the heat of the sun, for it seemed more powerful in their time than ours. I came upon one of those old ruined buildings that I had mentioned to you earlier, and seeing how dark and cool it looked within its walls, I ventured inside to have a look. The sudden change from bright sunlight to total darkness played strange tricks on my eyes, and for a few moments I could not see anything clearly. Once this had passed, I began to feel my way around the interior. I had to be very careful, for the floor was very uneven and covered with large broken stones. As my eyes became more used to the darkness, I suddenly froze in fear. Before me, I could see a pair of large animal-like eyes looking at me from within the darkest of corners. I did not move, for if I ran away, the animal might discover my fear. Then I started to think about how safe the people seemed to feel during the day, and this helped me to gain some courage. Stepping forward, I spoke to that pair of eyes, and they moved away from me a little. Feeling even braver, I reached out my hand and felt something soft. Immediately, the animal jumped from the dark and ran past me, faster than anything I had ever seen run before. I followed it with my eyes as best I could and saw it disappear into the darkness of another corner of the large room. Although it moved with incredible speed, I was able to make out some of its features. It was almost like a large white monkey. It had big grayish-red eyes and long hair that ran from its head down its back. But at the time, I could not remember if it ran on 2 or 4 legs. Once the room was silent, I walked over to the corner it had run to. Again, as this was a darker part of the room, it took some time for my eyes to get accustomed to it. Soon I could see a hole in the ground, very much like the holes I described to you earlier. I ran over to it, lit a match, and looked inside. There I found the animal quickly crawling down toward the bottom. It now looked less like a large monkey and more like a spider. It kept its eyes on me the whole time it descended. Then the flame of the match reached my fingers and went out. Lighting another, I found that the animal had disappeared. I stayed there, lighting match after match, looking down into that hole, trying to understand what it all meant. Then I was suddenly hit with the idea that these spider-like creatures might actually be human. a theory began to form in my mind. Humans, instead of remaining one type of animal, had separated into two types, those that lived above ground during the day and those that lived underground, only coming out at night. Then I remembered how, while wandering about, I had found numerous holes spread out across the land. Then there was the sound of machinery that came from the holes, and the thought suddenly came to me that there might be whole cities under the earth, filled with these nighttime humans. I began to wonder about the relationship between these two types of humans. The need to find out more about these underground people grew stronger as I sat there looking down into the hole. I decided that, as frightening as it looked, I had to go down there and see what there was to see. However, just as I was about to climb down, I heard two people running toward the building outside. A girl then appeared near the building's entrance, followed by a boy. They seemed to be playing and throwing flowers at each other, laughing all the while. Seeing me sitting on the edge of the hole, they stopped suddenly, all joy quickly leaving their faces. I tried to ask them about the hole, but they turned away from me and ran. Then I changed my mind, thinking that it might be better to first gather more information about the underground humans before going down below myself. So I left the building and started toward the village in search of Weena, who I hoped would be able to help me. While walking, I tried to piece together everything I had so far learned about this time period. It seemed to me that the people above ground were the more privileged humans. Remembering how in the England of our time we tended more and more to put industry underground in order to hide its ugliness from daily life, and seeing how now, in this new time, all industry, the factories, the railroads, the powerhouses, were completely underground, I assumed that those humans below were the common workers, providing all the comforts to the humans above. In other words, this world seemed to be a more extreme version of what we know England to be like. The rich were in total control and lived in total comfort, while the workers lived among their machines and obeyed the rich. But then I wondered why it was that the Morlocks, that was what I learned the underground humans were called, had stolen my time machine. If the Eloi, the above-ground people, had power over the Morlocks, why wouldn't they be able to help me get it back? And why were the Eloi so afraid of the dark? Were they afraid of the Morlocks? When I finally found Weena, I began to ask her about the Morlocks. She responded in the same way as everyone else. She refused to speak about it, and the more I asked her, the more upset she became, until finally she started to cry. I stopped myself at that point and held her hand in mine. This calmed her, and soon she was smiling and singing to herself again, while I sat there troubled by the things I was beginning to learn about this world. Chapter 6. For 2 days I did nothing. I had begun to feel the same about the Morlocks as the Elois felt. I found their appearance rather disgusting. The color of their skin reminded me of the little white worms we used to examine in school. I even began to have feelings of fear, which prevented me from sleeping well at night. For this reason, I let Weena sleep with the others, which made both of us more comfortable. Sitting up, unable to sleep, I looked at the moon and noticed that it was less bright tonight than before. It worried me to think what might happen later in the week as the nights became darker. The Morlocks would surely find this to their advantage and come out in increasingly larger numbers. As horrible as the thought was, I knew that in order to get my time machine back, I would have to go underground. If only I had had a partner, a fellow time traveler to accompany me, I would have been much less afraid. Imagining myself climbing down into the darkness alone made my whole body shake and shiver. My discomfort with this idea made me avoid the holes the next day, and I wandered farther than ever from the village to see what I might find. In the southwest, towards the end of the day's exploration, I saw in the distance a building much larger than all the others. Because of its light green color and curved rooftop, it seemed almost Chinese in design. I wondered what the purpose of this building could be and planned to investigate it directly. But seeing how late it was getting, I decided to wait until the following day. However, the next morning I became aware of the fact that, although the green building interested me, it was just another way to continue to avoid doing what I knew I had to do. No, I would not return to the southwest today. It was time for me to go underground. Taking Weena with me, I walked up the hill to the large ruined building I had found on the day I arrived in this world. The entire way up, Weena danced and sang, but when we arrived at the well, and she noticed my great interest in it, her happiness quickly disappeared. Putting one leg over the side of the hole, I looked at her and blew a kiss. She ran toward me, but I took this as an opportunity to get over my fear and quickly climbed down. I grabbed onto the metal bars that lined the hole from top to bottom and proceeded downward. Looking up toward the sunlight, I saw Weena's face looking down at me in horrible fear. She began to cry, and I stopped and put my finger to my lips to tell her to stop making so much noise. Then, smiling up at her, I continued further down. The hole was much deeper than I had expected. Soon, the sunlight from above no longer reached me, and I was surrounded in darkness. The hole seemed as though it had no bottom, and my body ached from the difficulty of the climb. I stopped to catch my breath and rest my arms and back. However, in doing so, the metal bar I held onto started to break from the wall, and soon I found myself hanging by one arm. With my feet, I quickly caught hold of a lower bar and immediately started moving downward again. From then on, I told myself that there would be no more resting, no matter how much pain I felt, for it appeared that this ladder had been designed for use by something much lighter than I was. Looking up, the top of the hole had become a small blue circle, and I was glad to see that Weena was no longer there. The hole seemed to go on forever below me. However, just as I started to doubt my ability to make it to the bottom, I found no metal bar to step on. Feeling around a little with my feet, I realized that there was a large hole in the wall. I climbed into it and discovered a long, narrow passage. Although the passage should have frightened me a little, because it made it more possible that I would meet a Morlock, I was happy to have the opportunity to rest my aching body. The noise of the machinery had grown quite loud this far down, and the darkness now robbed me of all sight. I was nervous, but I was also very weak from the climb, and my arms and legs shook from the effort. I needed to lie down for a while and get my strength back, for if I continued on now, I would be helpless to defend myself if necessary. So, feeling about the ground of the passageway, I cleared away the stones and large pieces of dirt that would have hurt my back and made a space for sleeping. Lying there, I found that there was no difference in my eyes being opened or closed. So dark it was down there. Soon my eyes grew heavy, and within minutes I was fast asleep. It is hard to say how long I lay there. I would probably have slept for quite a while longer if I had not felt the touch of a small hand on my face. Quickly, I reached into my pockets for the matches. I struggled to quickly light one, and as soon as I had succeeded, I saw before me 3 Morlocks crowded around me. They immediately jumped back away from the tiny flame of my match. However, it was not from fear that they reacted this way, but rather, like many animals of the underworld, they were used to living in complete darkness, so their eyes were extremely sensitive to even the smallest amount of light. It seemed that this small amount of light made it impossible for them to find me. All that I could see of them now were their glowing eyes looking back at me from far off down the passageway. They seemed to speak a different language entirely, for after calling out to them in the language of the Eloi, I got no response. I thought about escaping back up the hole, but calmed myself, saying, "You have come this far. You cannot turn back now." As I walked farther down the tunnel, the sound of the machinery grew louder. Moments later, I found myself inside a large room, so large that I could not see it clearly, for my match gave off too little light. However, I could see the Morlocks pressed against the walls all around me, trying to get as far away from my match as possible. Behind them, I could barely make out the large shadows of what appeared to be loudly operating machinery. Walking slowly forward, I became aware of the strong smell of fresh blood in the air, and at the same time, a metal table came into view. There appeared to be a meal laid on top of the table. As I came closer, I realized that on the plates were rather large pieces of meat, and I wondered what animal could have provided the Morlocks with such portions. I had not seen any animals or pets above ground. There were no longer cows, pigs, or lambs in this time. They had died off thousands of years ago. I assumed that this was the reason that the Eloi ate only fruit. However, seeing that the Morlocks ate meat, I wondered why there was this difference in diet between the two peoples. Then my match lost its flame, and I was again in pure darkness. Right away, I could hear the Morlocks beginning to move toward me. I became angry with myself for having prepared so poorly for such an adventure. I had brought nothing with which to defend myself. I had only my feet to run with and 4 more matches. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my arm and then another on my face. I tried reaching for my box of matches and grabbed it just in time, for someone was trying to take them out of my pocket. From every direction came these disgusting creatures, pulling at my hair and my clothing. Because I could not get hold of the matches firmly, I shouted as loud as I could. This seemed to frighten the Morlocks a little, for they jumped away. But very soon they came at me again. They were much less afraid than before, having realized how helpless I was. They took hold of me with much more strength than before, and I knew that I had no time to waste if I was to try and escape. I managed to light a match, and tearing a sheet of paper from my little notepad, I was able to make an even larger flame. The Morlocks fell back quickly, and I took the opportunity to run back into the little passageway from which I had just come. However, as I ran, the flame died, and again I could hear the sound of hundreds of feet, like a heavy rain, coming toward me at great speed. Several hands soon grabbed hold of my feet and were trying to pull me back out of the passage. I lit another match and shone it in their faces. I then ran as fast as I could toward the end of the passage. After about 30 meters, I stopped, lit another match, and began to walk backwards, for I could hear the Morlocks getting closer. The flame was almost to my fingers when I found myself at the end of the tunnel. Feeling blindly for the metal bars, I managed to grab hold of one, but at the same moment the Morlocks had caught up with me and taken my feet again in their hands. With a firm hold on the metal bars above, I kicked wildly at the enemy below and luckily freed myself. With all of my strength, I speedily climbed up the wall, forgetting how weak the bars were and causing many of them to break off under my feet. However, this accident actually helped me to escape the Morlocks, because one of them, who had decided to brave the light above and chase after me, found no metal bars to hold on to and soon gave up. I climbed for what seemed like hours, but my fear overpowered my weakness and allowed me to get within a few meters of the top. But then my pain caught up with me, almost preventing me from climbing further. My hands started to shake so much that I feared they could no longer hold on to anything. My head started to spin. I was about to lose consciousness at any moment. Somehow, I managed to climb those last few feet and pull myself out of the hole. Before falling on my face, I remember seeing Weena running toward me, crying with joy to see me still alive. And then there was only darkness. Chapter 7. My troubles were now far greater than before. Before, I had thought I only had to learn the ways of the simple Eloi in order to find my time machine and return to our time. However, after discovering the Morlocks, I no longer had the same confidence in my chances for success. These people below the ground seemed horrible to me. Now I could understand the Eloi's fear of the dark. However, I still was not clear about the relationship between the two peoples. There was a lot of talk among the Eloi about the coming moon, which would bring increasing darkness over the land at night time. It seemed that they knew something terrible was going to happen. It was clear to me now that my idea about the Eloi being the stronger of the two races had been completely wrong. It is possible that at one time in the past, the Eloi had ruled over the Morlocks, but somehow things had changed. The people above ground had become weak over time and lost their skills and intelligence, while those underground, being used to work and having to maintain their machines, had kept some of their strength. But why would the Morlocks continue to make things like food, housing, and clothing for the Eloi? I suppose that the Morlocks did this only out of habit and nothing more. Suddenly, I remembered seeing that meat in the machine room. Again, I had to think about this strange difference between the two peoples. How could the Morlocks be meat-eaters while the Eloi were vegetarian? I assumed that this was a result of the Eloi's laziness. They had lost their ability to hunt and possibly even to cook. One thing the Eloi did have, however, was fear. It seemed that in their talk about the coming darkness of the next few days, they felt helpless. Their fear made them incapable of planning a way to protect themselves. Although I was also afraid, I refused to let my fear control me, and immediately started to think of a way to hide from the Morlocks, as well as a way to fight them if necessary. Looking around, I found little safety in any of the buildings or nearby trees. Then I remembered that huge green building I had seen a few days before. I thought that it might be about 8 miles or so from our village. So, taking Weena by the hand, I started off early in the morning toward what I hoped would be a good hiding place. The day was a beautiful one, and Weena seemed to be in a good mood, for the whole time we walked, she was gathering flowers and putting them into my pockets for fun. "Oh, that reminds me," the scientist suddenly stopped his story. He began to search around inside his coat pockets, pulling out several strange white flowers and handing them to us in the sitting room. "Here are some of the flowers Weena gave me," he said, and then continued his tale. I was wrong, however, in thinking that the walk would be 8 miles. It turned out to be twice as far. To make matters worse, I found that my shoes were starting to fall apart from all the walking I had been doing during the week, and now parts of my feet were unprotected. This slowed us down quite a bit, so that by the time we arrived at the building, the sun was already beginning to set. Now, I am sure all of you are familiar with how quiet and calm things get just before the sun goes completely down. Well, that night, I cannot tell you how frightening this time of day seemed to me. It felt as though it were a sign of some kind, a signal for something terrible to begin. I imagined that I could feel the Morlocks moving about me underground, preparing for their attack upon these helpless Eloi. I started to fear that my entering their underground world had somehow begun a war between the two peoples. As we continued on our journey, the darkness deepened around us, and Weena became increasingly tired and fearful. I held her close to me and tried talking a little in an attempt to comfort her. Then we came to a small river, which we easily crossed, for it was not very deep. On the other side was a dark forest. It seemed to go on for miles, so I thought it a bad idea to enter. I could no longer see the green building that was our destination, and was already starting to lose my sense of direction. Within the thick forest, we would surely become lost. It was also hard to say what dangers, other than the Morlocks, awaited us in that dark stretch of trees. Also, my feet were in terrible pain now. It seemed that both Weena and I needed a rest. So we decided to stay in the middle of a large field, where the dim light of the moon enabled us to at least see shadows. Weena immediately lay down and fell asleep. I placed my jacket over her to keep her warm. Looking up at the sky, I noticed how the brightly shining stars formed a different pattern than the ones in our time, and there was a new, large red star hanging over the earth in what I guessed was the east. I kept thinking how the earth must look the same to those stars over these hundreds of thousands of years, and yet how much it has actually changed. All of the great knowledge and culture of the past was now gone from the earth, replaced by these two peoples, one beautifully simple and ignorant, and the other terribly disgusting and cruel. Again, I tried to imagine the relationship between the Eloi and the Morlocks. Then, suddenly, I understood where that meat had come from. I looked down at my little Weena, sleeping peacefully, and tried not to think any more about those ugly white monsters. That whole night, I saw nothing of the Morlocks. As the sun began to rise up into the sky, I noticed that my foot was red and swollen. My shoes were now in such bad condition that I threw them into the river, determined to go barefoot until I could return to the village and get some sandals. I woke up Weena, and together we walked into the woods. We met some other people in the woods and sat down to breakfast with them, laughing and eating all the while. I started to feel foolish for having been so afraid of the night-time. But then I remembered the meat I had seen below, I knew now that what I had seen was the leg of an Eloi human meat. I understood now that the Morlocks had at some time in the past run out of food. They probably started to eat anything they could find. I am sure that they first hunted small animals like rats, but eventually these animals probably disappeared, leaving them no other choice but to hunt humans. In the early parts of world history, there is some evidence of humans sometimes eating other humans. Of course, as people became increasingly civilized, they gained greater intelligence, and the idea of eating other humans became more terrible. However, the Morlocks had lost most of their civilization. They now had only the sense that eating other Morlocks would be wrong, and in this way, they stopped seeing the Eloi as human beings. To them, the Eloi had become nothing more than what cows are to humans in our own time. I must admit that part of me felt that the Eloi might have deserved this. Humans, even in our time, have always made terrible use of their power by forcing animals and other humans to work for them. Now, it seemed, nature was having its revenge upon humans. However, I could not help pitying the poor Eloi, for they seemed so innocent. And of course, I had grown very close to my little Weena. I could not see her as deserving any type of cruel punishment, nor did I, being human myself, feel that I deserved to die a horrible death at the hands of the Morlocks. So I decided to continue with my plan to find a safe place, which I still hoped the green building might provide, and find some way to defend against the creatures below. When I thought about it, fire seemed like one of the best ways to keep the Morlocks away. I also needed to come up with a way to get to my time machine, for I had made up my mind to take Weena back with me to our time. I could not stand the idea of her staying in such a terrible place as this, waiting to be taken below and eaten by those horrible monsters. Chapter 8. The green building was in very bad condition. All of its windows were broken, and the decoration on the outside walls had fallen off long ago. There was strange writing above the entrance. I asked Weena to try and read it, but then it occurred to me that these people had no written language. The interior of the building was very impressive. The first part formed a large hall, all around which were tall windows. The rays of light shining through them reflected beautifully from the thousands of years of dust that hung in the air. Ancient scenes showing animals from long ago roaming about the fields and forests were painted on the walls. It could be seen that the wall, facing the windows, had also been painted at one time, but now was reduced to just a few treetops and what looked to be a person's head. The color faded from years of exposure to damaging sunlight. I saw what appeared to be animal bones lying about in different areas of the floor, and along the lower part of the walls were little windows, behind which could be seen ancient-looking objects, such as jewelry, clothing, and pottery. Looking back at the bones, they reminded me of some that I had recently seen at a museum in England. A museum, I said to myself. That is it. We're in a museum. You cannot imagine how excited I was. The possibilities this place had to offer seemed endless. I could learn so much about how this world had come to be as it now was. I could see at what point in history human beings were at their greatest and most powerful, and at what time they began to lose this greatness and move back toward being simple animals again. I guessed that there was probably an enormous library somewhere that housed all kinds of interesting books for me to choose from. However, these were things that would have to wait to be explored another time, for the current situation required more useful information and materials. So, taking Weena's hand in mine, we moved on to search about the place for whatever might prove helpful. The next room was full of rare rocks and minerals from deep inside the earth. I have very little knowledge of or interest in this science. I did not look at anything too carefully until I found sulfur, which is referred to as S in scientific chemistry tables. I wondered if there might be a way for me to make a gun or some kind of bomb. But there were many other things I would need in order to do that, so I decided that it was impossible. The next room, however, proved to be extremely interesting for me. It was a huge hall full of machines. Unfortunately, there was no way for me to guess what they might have once been used for. Yet I was no less interested in them, and I would have probably stood staring at them for hours if Weena had not come running over to me and cried out. Taking hold of my head with both hands, she turned my eyes toward the other end of the room. There, the floor seemed to sink deep into the ground, making a very large opening. As we walked closer, I could hear the sound of those machines I had heard down in the Morlocks hole getting louder. The size of their underground city revealed itself to me in that moment. My God, how many of them were there? If I were truly to try and help the Eloi, I would have to teach them how to fight. There was no way for me to fight the Morlocks all on my own. This made my heart sink, for I knew that the Eloi would make useless soldiers. They had no strength, no skill, and no intelligence. If we were to challenge the creatures below in battle, I feared it would be nothing more than suicide. My plan suddenly came back to me with even greater importance than before, and I immediately began to look around for possible weapons. Running over to one of the machines, I took hold of one of its levers and started to pull it down toward me with all my strength. Happily, the lever broke off in my hands, so that now I had a long metal bar to beat any approaching Morlocks with. I had the urge to run down into that darkness and kill as many as I could, but I knew that my time would be better spent looking for more weapons with which to protect myself and Weena. Moving on, we came upon a room of books. Actually, I should say a room of what used to be books, for now all that remained of them were scattered pieces of paper, with little to no writing on them whatsoever. At the sight of this, I could not help feeling that everything we are doing in our time, all the work we are putting toward understanding and improving our world, was nothing but a pure waste of time and effort. Again, Weena squeezed my arm and reawakened me to the present concern. I looked about the room for something useful, but saw nothing. Then, in one corner there seemed to be an area still untouched by time and in pretty good condition. I searched it high and low, feeling more and more the lateness of the afternoon. Below the windows was a set of drawers full of metal boxes. I opened them all, and you will never guess what I found: a box of matches. They looked almost as good as new, too. I tried lighting one, but accidentally broke the stick. Then, testing a second one, I was successful. I became so excited that I started to dance like a fool in the middle of the room. I could not believe my luck. Moments later, I found something else equally as useful: oil, which could help me to light fires. It came in several cans. I quickly gathered all of them up and put them deep into my pockets along with the matches. Later on, I found knives and guns, but I felt that my metal bar was stronger than the knives, and I have never been very good with guns, so I chose not to weigh myself down with such things. We spent the entire day inside the old museum, going from room to room. By nightfall, we found ourselves in a little courtyard with grass in the center. We sat down there to rest for a while. I was much more hopeful now that I had something with which to fight the Morlocks. I decided that, because it was too late to return to the village, it would be best to sleep in an open area and surround ourselves with a ring of fire. Tomorrow we would walk back to the village and with my newly obtained metal bar try to open the base of the Birdman statue where I hoped my time machine would be waiting. Chapter 9. We exited the green building and found that the sun had not quite gone down. This was very encouraging to me. I wanted to get back to the village as early as possible tomorrow morning, so I felt it necessary to walk part of the way tonight. My plan was to walk back into the woods and then build a fire all around Weena and myself so that we could sleep safely. Heading toward the woods, I gathered as many sticks and leaves as I could. Soon I had a large collection in my arms, but it made walking quite difficult, seriously slowing us down. At this point, I had been awake for 2 days and 1 night. I was becoming increasingly tired and feared that I would not be able to go much further. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, the sun had gone completely down. The forest looked as dark and unfriendly as it had the night before. Weena did not want to enter, but as I looked back toward where we had just come from, I could see a few moving shadows, and I decided that we should keep moving forward. On the other side of the forest, I remembered seeing a hill without trees, and I thought that that might be the safest place for us to rest tonight. But we would have to get through the forest as quickly as we could, and to do that, I would have to empty my arms and hands of this heavy load of sticks and leaves. Seeing the shadows coming toward us, I thought of an idea. Throwing the sticks and leaves to the ground, I set it afire, hoping that it might keep the Morlocks from following. Once lit, the fire grew quickly, and Weena, who had never seen a fire that large before, became excited and almost jumped into it. I had to grab her and hold her as tightly as I could to prevent her from hurting herself. Because she would not walk away from the fire, I had to pick her up and carry her into the woods. After about 10 meters or so, I put her down again and looked back to see how the fire was doing. It seemed to have spread to the surrounding dry grass and was quickly making its way up the hill toward the shadows I had earlier seen. Walking forward, the darkness all around us was soon complete. Everything seemed very quiet, for the only sound we could hear was of our own footsteps. However, then I began to hear other sounds, other footsteps. I pulled Weena faster through the trees, knowing exactly what was coming toward us. But no matter how fast we walked, the Morlocks seemed to still get closer and closer. Soon I could hear their voices as well as their walking, and suddenly there was something pulling at my coat. I had to let go of Weena's hand for a moment as I quickly searched for my box of matches. At the same time, I felt more and more hands feeling about my body. Finally, I got a hold of the matches and lit one. In the light, I could see the white creatures running away, while on the ground lay Weena, her arms wrapped tightly around my legs. I could not tell if she was breathing. A terrible fear came over me, and I bent down to see if she was still alive. From the sounds all around us, it seemed that there were dozens of Morlocks waiting in the shadows for my match to burn out. I took out the oil I had found in the museum and lit it. I threw it to the ground, and it immediately grew into a large flame. Now I felt it was safe to examine Weena. So, taking hold of her wrist, I found that she had only fainted. I picked her up and put her over my shoulder, preparing to continue our journey. However, after fighting off the Morlocks coming at me from all directions, I no longer knew which way would get us through the woods. I decided that the best thing to do was to remain where we were. Putting Weena gently on the ground, I began to gather more sticks and leaves in order to build a fire. While I did this, I could see the light of the fire reflecting from the eyes of the surrounding Morlocks. Moments later, my fire went out, but I was ready with a match. As soon as I had lit it, I could see that 2 Morlocks, who had been getting closer and closer to Weena, were now running away. One was so blinded by the match that he ran directly toward me. I hit him in the side with my fist. He cried out in pain and then ran off into the trees. I now had enough wood and leaves to build a fire. As soon as it was burning well, I tried to wake Weena, but it was as if she were dead. I gave up and looked about me for more wood to burn, for this fire would only last 1 hour. I gathered up some more sticks, and then, tired from all of the work I had done that night, decided to sit down and rest a while. The smoke from the fire, as well as the smell of the burning oil, made my eyes heavy. I felt that I had only closed my eyes for a moment. However, when I opened them, I could see that the fire had died long ago, and my entire body was in the hands of several Morlocks. I tried fighting them off, reaching into my pocket for the matches, but they were not there. The monsters had a hold of my arms, legs, and hair, and were pulling me down to the ground. I felt their sharp teeth starting to bite at my neck, and I thought that I was sure to die there in that distant time in which I did not belong. But then my right arm became free, and I felt around the ground for my metal bar. Once I had found it, I struggled with all my strength to get back onto my feet, and then started swinging the bar wildly around me. Several times I felt it hit something soft, followed by a painful scream. Soon I was free again, and it seemed that the Morlocks might have given up on trying to capture me, for my metal bar no longer struck any bodies. My eyes quickly got used to the darkness, and moments later I could see several dead Morlocks at my feet. When I looked up again, I could see others running away from me at great speed. I thought that maybe I had frightened them, but feeling something hot behind me, I turned and found that my original fire had quickly grown huge and was now coming toward me. Looking all over the ground, I could not find Weena anywhere. I had very little time to think. I had to move, or the fire would soon catch up to me. I started to run after the Morlocks. As I ran, the fire raced past me and cut me off, forcing me to run to my left. It did not take long before I found myself among the escaping Morlocks. I struck them from behind with my bar as they ran, killing some of them and badly injuring others. I had feelings of extreme anger combined with extreme fear, and this made me stronger and more violent than usual. I hit at anything that came near me. In a small clearing, I ran into about 30 or more Morlocks, all blinded by the forest fire, running in circles and screaming from fear. I searched about for Weena, but she was not there. A new and stronger anger took hold of me, and I ran into that group of pitiful creatures, screaming like a crazy man, and determined to kill every last one of them. I smashed their bones with my metal bar and crushed their heads under my feet. My hands squeezed the last drop of blood from their miserable bodies. I do not know how long I carried on in this way, but when it was all over, I found myself surrounded by dozens of dead Morlocks. There were many more still alive, but I realized that they had been made harmless by the fire. Many of them were so confused that they ran directly into the fire, killing themselves. Seeing this, I decided not to waste my time and energy any further. I now devoted myself to looking for Weena. All night I searched but never did find her. It became clear that the Morlocks had taken her, but having become so blind and frightened by the fire, they dropped her in the woods and left her there to die. It felt like a terrible dream. I could not believe that what had just happened was real. I lay on the ground among the dead, crying to God to wake me up, but I found myself ignored and had nothing more to do than sit there with my head in my hands among the painful cries of the remaining dying Morlocks. The sun then began to rise. As the light of day grew brighter, I could see smoke rising from the blackened ground of the now destroyed forest. I was deeply sad to see what destruction my foolishness had caused, and I considered it my own fault that Weena had died. I hated myself for having started that fire and for later falling asleep. But it was now a fact that both Weena and this forest were gone. There was nothing I could do to change that. I felt alone and helpless in the world again. I began to miss my home and all of my friends. It hurt me deeply to think that I had possibly lost everything I once loved. However, through this sadness, I could still see some hope. There was still the possibility of getting my time machine back. I did my best to wipe away the dried blood that covered my hands, and then wrapped dry grass around my feet for protection. Standing up, I tried to get a sense of which direction the village was in. Then, out of the corner of my right eye, I saw something purple just at the edge of the burned forest. "Weena!" I shouted as I ran toward what appeared to be her gown. And indeed, it was her clothing. However, her body was nowhere to be found. I assumed that it had somehow come off while she was being carried away, and had remained in the hands of one of the Morlocks, only to be dropped here during his flight from the forest. I picked up the gown and put it to my nose to try and smell Weena again, but the odor of smoke was too strong. Tying it around my waist, I looked for the way back to the village. Since there was no forest now, I could see the green building clearly. Using the green building as a guide, I decided that the way back to the statue and the village lay to my right. I began my walk, more tired and lonely than I had ever been before, determined to beat down the walls of that Birdman statue with my bare hands if necessary, for there was nothing more for me in this world. It was time to go home. Chapter 10. By 9 o'clock that morning, I was sitting up on that same hill, next to the old ruined building, looking over the land as I had on my first day of arrival. Everything looked the same as before. It was a beautifully green world, filled with the laughter of those simple people, the Eloi. But my knowledge of this place was now greater, So this time I was not so easily fooled by the beauty around me. I saw things as they truly were. The Eloi were nothing more than animals, fed and cared for by the same people who would later kill them for food. I noticed that some people were bathing in the same part of the river where I had helped Weena. Tears came to my eyes, and I thought to myself, my poor girl, what a horrible death she had suffered. However, it helped a little to think that maybe it had been less horrible than the one the Eloi usually suffered at the hands of the Morlocks. I knew that nature made it necessary for people and most animals to eat meat. I myself love a good steak as much as the next person, but I could not accept the Morlocks making meals of the Eloi. I decided to make one last effort to save these people, or rather, I decided to make one last effort to get these people to save themselves. Walking back down to the village, desperately tired, but determined, I gathered all of the people that I met on my way. They all happily followed me, laughing and playing with one another the whole way. Once in the village, I tried to pull everyone together in the center of town for a meeting. To do this, it was necessary to make them all sit down, for if left standing, they would forget what they were doing and start to wander off. After about an hour, I managed to collect almost everyone. They all seemed confused, thinking it must be time to eat or sleep. My next task was to get their full attention. I clapped my hands and started to shout for them to be quiet, but this only scared those closest to me and went completely ignored by those furthest away. Not knowing what else to do, I started to sing an old English children's song. A silence then immediately fell over the crowd, and they all turned their heads to look at me. Still singing, but with much greater confidence now, I then untied Weena's gown from around my waist and held it high in the air. They did not seem to understand. Noticing that the blood stains were hidden from them, I turned the gown around so that the front faced them. Still, they could not get what had happened. I placed the gown against my own body to show them where the blood would have come from. I imitated the movements and sounds of the Morlocks. I did everything I could think of to communicate the horrible news to them, but they only seemed to find my behavior amusing. Many started to laugh, while others began to imitate me. I became more and more desperate and ran into the crowd, pushing the bloodied gown close to their faces. This only drew more laughter from them. However, soon the people lost interest. Seeing them begin to wander away, I started to sing louder, but this failed to get their attention. I then grabbed the person nearest me and wrapped my arm around his neck as if to choke him. He did not struggle, and no one seemed to notice. I shouted angrily at them, "Look at me! Look at me!" and tightened my grip around the poor Eloi's neck in order to convince them of my seriousness. This finally got their attention, and silence once again overcame the crowd, for I was no longer singing. They looked at me, confused, trying to understand what was happening. I, of course, had no intention of hurting this little man. I only wanted to see if these people would help each other. I did not have much hope in this, for I remembered how Weena was left to drown in the river after accidentally falling in. But this was a slightly different situation. This was one of their people being attacked. Unfortunately, my behavior did not have the effect I had hoped it might. I noticed one woman toward the center of the crowd slowly coming toward me. I shook the little man in my arms to remind the people of the danger he was in. This did not stop the woman's approach. She was wearing the same confused expression that everyone else did. As she came closer, she reached out a hand toward my prisoner. I cried out to try and scare her. She paused for a moment, her eyes widening a little. Then she placed her hand gently on the little man's stomach. I looked down and saw that Weena's gown was hanging from my arm against this man's body, and the area covering his stomach was also the area covered in Weena's blood. I looked back at the woman standing before us. Her eyes had changed, looking now more frightened than confused. And suddenly, from her mouth came a high scream that immediately woke everyone else from their confusion, including the little man in my arms. Now everyone began to scream and run in the direction of the great dining hall. I let go of my prisoner, and he followed them as well. Soon I was standing alone in the center of the village. It truly was hopeless. I had hoped to teach them to fight, to resist the Morlocks, but it seemed that things were as nature had designed them to be, once and for all. With only myself as the single intelligent being in this world, there was very little that could be done to bring any change. With 2 days of sleeplessness behind me, I desperately needed rest. I knew that I was not welcome in any of the buildings, so I decided to find a comfortable place near the river. Once there, I laid my jacket out on the ground and fell asleep as soon as my head felt the soft grass underneath. I awoke just before sunset, feeling very fresh and rested. I felt very capable of taking on the Morlocks by myself if I had to. Putting my jacket back on, I noticed something fall to the ground from my pockets. They were matches. I quickly picked them up, now even more encouraged, and started to make my way toward the Birdman statue. To my surprise, I found the walls of the base slightly open in one part. I laughed out loud at this, for up until then I had planned to fight it out to the end, but now I had nothing more to do than simply walk through. In a dark corner of the space inside the statue, I saw my time machine. At once, I knew what the Morlocks had planned for me. I smiled, and feeling the levers in my pocket, began to approach the machine. After only a few steps, the wall suddenly closed loudly behind me. I laughed at how smart the Morlocks must have thought they were. They believed I was trapped. Then I could hear the sound of their disgusting little voices coming toward me in the darkness. I reached for my matches, but then realized that I would not be able to light them, for I needed the box to strike them against. All of my confidence suddenly escaped me, and I immediately started to feel my way toward the time machine. Little hands were soon pulling at my clothing, and I began to beat them off with my fists. I found my way to the machine and jumped inside with the levers in both my hands. But the Morlocks were trying to take the levers from me. I managed to attach one of them properly, but the other fell from my hands, and immediately there was a struggle between myself and the monsters to get hold of it. I kicked at them and struck them with the front of my head. I felt a couple of bites sink into my arms, but soon I had the lever, and within seconds it was attached. Kicking the last of the Morlocks from the machine, I started it up and pulled back the lever. Before me the darkness quickly fell away, and I found myself once again traveling through time. Chapter 11. In my hurry to get away from the Morlocks, I had not had the time to properly sit in the machine's seat. So I was moving extremely quickly through time sitting a little uncomfortably on my side. Without thinking or seeing what I was doing, I had pushed the levers as far down as they could move. The speed at which I was now traveling made me feel very ill, for I must have been jumping hundreds of years every second. Then I noticed something strange. Even though I was moving faster than ever before, the alternation of light and dark that marked the passing of days, something which should only have happened at a much slower speed, began again to occur. And as I continued further into the future, the flashing light grew slower until finally a single, unchanging light, similar to the light we see just before the sun completely sets, remained. The moon had disappeared entirely, and the sun, much larger now than before, cast its light on the earth, but now only from the west. It seemed that the earth had stopped spinning, and now only one part of it faced the sun, much like the moon in our time faces us. I decided to stop and have a look around. Very carefully, I started to pull back the levers, for I did not want to be thrown from the machine as I had before. Soon I saw a beach, and beyond it the sea. This part of the earth had remained mostly in darkness, except for the western edge, which possessed a faint red glow from the sun. There were no stars to be seen in the sky above me. The sea was very calm. No wind blew. No waves crashed. I would have thought it dead had I not noticed a line of salt a few meters from the edge of the water, telling me that even though there was no moon, there was still some kind of tide. My breathing was much more difficult than usual, indicating a great decrease in breathable air. The ground, in all directions except that of the sea, was completely covered by thin green vegetation. It looked very much like the type of plants which grow in areas of very little light, such as caves or the bottom of a thick forest. Suddenly, up on a hill to my left, I heard a terrible scream. There, I saw a huge animal spread its wings and take flight. It looked like a giant insect, larger than a man. I grabbed the levers in case of a sudden need to escape, but was relieved to see the creature fly away behind some hills in the distance. However, in the corner of my eye, I noticed something moving at my right. I turned and found a huge crab coming toward me. It was as large as my time machine, but it moved very slowly. On my cheek, I then felt what seemed like a bug of some kind. I hit at it with my right hand, but was surprised to feel something long and stick-like there. I grabbed hold of it, and turning backwards, saw that it was the feeler of yet another crab just behind me. It was just about to try and grab me when I pushed the levers forward a little and distanced myself from it by a month. The world, of course, looked very much the same, except that there were now even more crabs on the beach. I decided that this period of time on Earth had very little to keep my interest, so I traveled 100 years further. Again, everything seemed the same, but now a new kind of moon had appeared in the eastern part of the sky. I pushed the levers forward again, and this time kept going until I saw no more of those crabs. I was approaching 30 million years into the future when I finally stopped the machine again. I found myself in what seemed to be the beginnings of an ice age. The air was very cold, and the ground covered in white snow, but only the edge of the sea was frozen. I tried to find some kind of sign of life, but there was nothing. I thought that I had seen something black jumping about the beach, but when I looked carefully at it, It looked as though it had never moved. I felt that my eyes were playing tricks on me. In the west, a black shadow seemed to begin to cover part of the sun I could see from this side of the earth. It was an eclipse, just as in our day when the moon passes between the earth and the sun. However, this was no moon. It was much too large. No, I believe that it was one of the planets which had moved closer to ours. Possibly Mercury. I could not be certain. Once it had moved into place and had covered the sun entirely, the earth was in nearly total darkness. I could feel more and more flakes of snow starting to fall. And what I became most aware of was the silence all around me. There were no birds, no sounds from the sea, no wind, just silence. It felt like death. My whole body shook with cold. But then, moments later, the sun came back out from behind the planet and threw some of its light on the western horizon. Then, that black object I had thought I saw jumping about on the beach started to move again. It was only the size of a football, and it had long feelers hanging from what must have been its head. This was the only sign of life in this age that I could find. The terrible feeling of death was still present in my mind. I now felt that I had seen enough of the future, and that it was time to go back home. Chapter 12. Gradually, I saw the sun and moon return to their familiar position in the sky. I saw the returning signs of humanity and felt comforted. This had the effect of restoring my desire to explore. I still had a lot of curiosity about mankind in its most advanced age. Even though my feet were complaining, I told myself that I was allowed just one more stop. So I waited until the buildings seemed their highest and brightest, and then began to slow the machine down again. Once, at a complete stop, I looked down at my machine's time dial and found that I was in the year 3088, just a little more than 1,000 years ahead of my own time. Looking around, I seemed to be in the corner of a very large room of windows. Even the ceiling was made up of glass, through which sunlight shone brightly. Outside the windows, the room was almost completely surrounded by tall trees. On all sides, except for the southern one, toward the top of the windows could be seen the steel of huge buildings rising high into the sky. Inside, the room itself was completely empty, except for a single black door at the southern end. I climbed out of my seat, wondering what this place could be. While stepping away from the machine, my foot found no ground underneath, and I fell clumsily to the floor and reopened the cut on my chin. Picking myself up again, I turned round to find my machine sitting upon a stage of some kind. Suddenly, from behind the door, I heard the sound of people coming. Having nowhere to hide, I quickly ran toward my time machine. But before I could reach it, I heard the door open behind me. "Stop where you are!" a voice commanded. I did as I was told. Turning to see who was addressing me, I found a line of 10 men standing just inside the doorway. Half of them were dressed in fine suits. The other half I guessed were police, judging by their clothing and the gun-like objects they pointed at me. One of the well-dressed men then spoke. "Welcome! I apologize for the guns. However, we don't want you running away so quickly." I did not know how to respond. I had never had a gun pointed at me before, and I was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I decided to remain silent. "Of course, we knew you were coming," the man continued. We tried to stop you before, when you traveled into the future, but you surprised us with the speed of your journey, so we missed you. This time, however, well, here you are, aren't you? But I chose to stop here. I was not forced to stop, I said, quite confused. Yes, well, that may be. However, if you had tried to travel any further, you would have found it impossible. You see, over many years we have been designing this room for you. You could say it is a kind of net, and you the butterfly. As I said, we had been trying to catch you going forward into the future, but realized that we had assumed your speed to be much slower than it really was. So, we redesigned the room to catch you coming back from the future at a much higher speed. How did you know I was traveling at all? About 50 years ago, your writings on the development of a time machine were discovered in a storage room at one of the older universities. After a little research, we found that you had mysteriously disappeared at the fairly young age of 36, shortly after having built your machine. Although I could not be absolutely certain, I guessed that you had succeeded in your experiments. Well, now that you have me, what do you want from me? We simply want to examine your machine and ask you several questions about its construction. You see, we have attempted to rebuild it according to your writings. However, there seems to be something missing from your notes. Something you may not have had the time to write. Then one of the policemen stepped forward and whispered something into the man's ear. A moment later, the man turned back to me, saying, "If you will please come with us, I can explain more to you on the way to our laboratory." Several policemen then took hold of me and led me out the door. Outside, the air was quite fresh, as if I were in the countryside. However, the surrounding woods were not very deep, for just minutes later we walked out into a large city square full of people. At one end of the square were hundreds of tables where people were talking over food and drinks. At another end was an entertainment area. There, a large group of people had gathered to listen to 4 musicians. They were sitting on a small stage, each holding some kind of instrument, which they seemed to be playing with very serious concentration. However, no sound came from the stage. I thought that maybe they were just preparing to play until the musicians suddenly relaxed their concentration and stood up, while the crowd clapped their hands in great appreciation. The rest of the square was just an open space of people walking here and there, all wearing fine, colorful clothing, possibly on their way to work or home. I could not tell. I then noticed that I could not hear the sound of their feet as they hurried across the square, nor could my own footsteps be heard. Your city seems to have solved the problem of sound pollution. We haven't had pollution of any kind for hundreds of years. Our air and water are all 100% pure. I cannot imagine having to breathe the air of the London of your time. It's no wonder people die during those years before the age of 70. Such a short life compared to our 160 years. Now, please, this way, the man said, pointing to the entrance of a large building just behind the entertainment area. On my way through the doors, I noticed a number of soldiers standing around the edge of the square with guns hanging from their shoulders. High above them was a sign that had words running across it at great speed. Some people in the square were watching as the words entered the sign and then quickly disappeared. The words were unreadable to me, for they used a different alphabet than the one we are familiar with. The words came and went from the sign so quickly that I could not begin to read even the first word. The man must have noticed my confusion, for he then spoke. "Yes, that's English up there. However, much more simplified. It's now the only language spoken around the world." "But I can't read a single word of it." A new method of reading and writing has been developed, which allows us to read at a much faster rate than before. We can now finish a long book within just a few hours. "But how can your brain take in all of the information so quickly?" "It is just a matter of practice, lots of practice." I was then led to an electric elevator that seemed to go up for miles into the air, and there the man started to explain things to me as he had earlier promised. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Elsner. I once worked as a professor at Rensford University, where I taught engineering. That was during the good days, when the world was in perfect balance. As you can see, we have made life on Earth very comfortable for humans. However, as I am sure you know, this comfort could very soon disappear. Here we arrived at our floor. As the doors opened, before us stretched a long hallway. As we exited the elevator, Dr. Elsner continued, "There are only 2 countries in the world today. Our country is known as Ecton, and we, its people, are known as Ectonians. The other country is called Antus. For hundreds of years we lived very peacefully and often cooperated and openly traded with one another. However, for certain reasons that I will soon explain, over the years our 2 countries have come to hate one another. Every year we get closer and closer to world war. And, as you might imagine, war has changed quite a bit since your time. Both countries have developed weapons that could destroy the entire world within just a few seconds. The Ectonians are a peaceful people, happy with the balance of the world as it is now. The Antusians, as I said before, are a good people as well. However, their leader is a terrible man who, ever since coming into power 30 years ago, has made it his biggest goal to join our 2 countries under his leadership. He has become increasingly uncooperative, and there have been a few small battles fought quite far from our capital here. We fear that he may become more and more aggressive toward our country, the more we resist his attempts at taking control. At the time he took control over Antus, I had already been studying your experiments for 30 years and had become increasingly confident in the possibility of successfully repeating your work. The one problem was that I did not have the money to carry it out on my own. I needed to somehow get support from the government. I decided to write a book about your work and how it could make it possible for us to maintain our peaceful society. In this book, I explained that by going back in time, we could prevent the birth of the one man who is now trying to destroy our happiness. At once, the government promised me unlimited money in order to build the time machine. We had now reached a pair of large steel doors at the end of the hallway, which opened automatically as we approached them. Inside was a huge laboratory, and in the center of the room was a machine almost completely the same as my own. "Please, have a look at it," Elsner said. "Tell me if there is anything I have forgotten." The outside of the machine seemed to be complete. However, inside, I noticed that his dials were much more modern than mine, and the engine was missing several important parts. "It looks almost exactly like my machine," I said, "except it appears that your engine is incomplete." "Exactly. and that is why you are here. We are—" Elsner was suddenly interrupted by an extremely loud noise, like an alarm. Just then, a policeman came running down the hall and whispered something into Elsner's ear. The look on the doctor's face made it seem like something bad had happened. "What's wrong?" I asked. Elsner did not respond to my question. He was too busy shouting orders to the other policemen. Soon the doctor and I were the only ones in the laboratory. "It seems that I must again apologize to you. Your time machine has just been stolen." "What? By whom?" I shouted. "By the Anthusians." "Didn't you have soldiers guarding it?" "Of course, but it seems that there was a spy among our staff who found a way to steal it. Maybe he offered some of the guards money. I don't know. All of that doesn't matter now. What matters is that they have the machine and may be able to use it against us. We must act quickly and get the machine back from them before it's too late." "But how did the Anthusians know about the machine?" "All scientists around the world were made aware of the discovery of your notes, and I'm afraid that a copy of my book, intended only for the Ectonian government, fell into the hands of the Anthusians. Since then, we have been racing to be the first to develop your machine." Just then, another policeman entered the room. "Sir, the general would like to speak with you immediately." "You'll have to excuse me for a moment," Elsner said as he began to follow the officer out of the laboratory doors. "Just wait for me here. Do not leave this room." I noticed as the doors closed behind Dr. Elsner that he ordered a guard to stand outside the laboratory to make sure I did not try to escape. Then I was alone again, and the reality of everything that was happening to me began to sink in. How was I to get my machine back? In the future, the disappearance of my machine was very frightening, but also very easy to deal with because of the lack of technology and stupidity of the Morlocks. Now, however, I was dealing with very intelligent people in the most modern world the earth would ever see. My machine could be anywhere. I was completely at the mercy of these people. My head began to hurt and my knees started to weaken. Then the room went black. Chapter 13. Lying there, still thinking I was asleep, I could hear a voice speaking to me. "Can you hear me? Please, you must wake up now. Can you hear me?" I felt my body being shaken violently, followed by the same words. Soon I was able to open my eyes. I found myself lying on one of the work tables in the laboratory. Dr. Elsner was looking over me with worried eyes. "He's awakening. Quick, help me to sit him up." Then I felt several pairs of hands lifting my back from the table and turning me so that my legs hung over the side. Then a hand put something that smelled very horrible under my nose. I jumped back from it and found myself suddenly much more clear-headed. "We need your help, man," Elsner said to me hurriedly. "The people who stole your machine were caught trying to escape back to Antusia by boat. However, seeing that they were going to be arrested, they destroyed your machine just as we surrounded them." My heart felt like it would stop beating from sadness. I was going to have to stay in this world and watch it die before my eyes. I was never going to see my beloved laboratory or any of you ever again. Why had I stopped here? Elsner said I could not have returned home even if I had tried. But was that really true? "Come on, man. There is still hope to save us," Elsner shouted. "No," I said. "I've seen the future. I know what will happen to your world. You say that I had no choice. that I had to stop here, but I tell you that I stopped here on my own. I stopped here because it was the very end of modern humanity. I'm afraid that all of this must soon come to an end. We are aware of all that. Things have already started to get worse for us here. That is why we need you to finish building our time machine. Please, man, help us. I felt that I really had no choice. If I ever wanted to return to our time, I would have to build this machine. I knew that they would first want to use it themselves to carry out their plan. Of course, there was the risk that whoever used the machine might be killed during his mission or somehow fail to return. However, I decided that these were chances I would simply have to take. I agreed to finish the machine. Looking more closely at their machine, I realized that they were not just missing a few parts, but they had actually made many mistakes in its construction. Several connections were made using different materials from my own. I made a list of the problems and the new materials I would require and gave it to Elsner. Within a few hours, everything I needed was laid before me on the laboratory work table. Several assistants were assigned to me, and I never once had to lift a finger. I simply told the men what to do. They were excellent workers, and they used tools I had never seen before, but wished I had, for I could not believe the speed with which they worked. They did, in just 8 hours, what took me 8 days to do. By evening, the machine was finished. Elsner and I looked it over very carefully. He seemed very satisfied with the work, but still quite nervous. A question then came to me. Who would operate the machine? Traveling through time was a dangerous task. Someone would need to be familiar enough with how to operate the machine not to make any stupid mistakes that might prevent him from completing his mission. I then brought the issue up to Elsner. Well, it seems we have no choice but to send 2 people on the mission. One person will simply operate the machine, while the other carries out the plan. Do you mean to use me? I asked. You are the only experienced time traveler that I know. All that we ask you to do is take our man 94 years back in time. Then, once he has completed his mission, bring him back to us and you can return home. I suppose that I have no choice, really. Well, who, may I ask, will be my travel companion? At this, Elsner smiled and said, Me. And how do you plan to prevent the birth of the Untusian leader? I asked. That, I'm afraid, is information I cannot share with you at this time. Besides, it is hardly any concern of yours. It is my concern if it means being involved in a murder, I replied. It will be nothing more than a simple matter of poison. As I said, murder. No, it isn't a poison designed to kill, but rather to make a woman unable to have children. Now, I'm sorry, but I cannot give you any further details. It is time for us to go. I felt uncomfortable with the mission. I still had many questions, but Elsner did not seem to want to hear them. It frightened me a little, the idea of trying to change history. If this terrible Untusian leader were never born, who might replace him as leader? Maybe someone much worse. Surely they had thought about this. Either their plan was very poorly developed, or there were many other missions that I had not been told about. I decided that I should not trust everything this Dr. Elsner was telling me. 20 minutes later, several policemen entered the laboratory carrying 2 small bags. What are these for? I asked. Just some clothing and medical supplies for us in case we are hurt during the mission, answered Elsner. Here are some newer clothes for you to wear. Put them on now, for we'll be leaving as soon as you're ready." "I must warn you, Doctor, it is dangerous for us to travel in the machine from this laboratory." "Was this building here 94 years ago?" "No, it wasn't, actually," he answered. "Then this machine must be moved to the ground floor. If we were to travel here, we would fall from the sky once we came to a stop, and that would be the end of us. I would suggest that we put the machine in the room you used to catch me and travel from the same place I was traveling before." Immediately, Elsner instructed the police to gather as many men as possible to have the machine moved. I took the opportunity to change into the clothing he had given me. In just half an hour, we were back in the room of windows, ready to begin. Climbing into the machine, I had to take a few moments to get used to the few differences there were from my own machine. For example, the future and past levers were turned around so that I would have to pull to go forward and push to go back. Elsner climbed in next to me. He looked very nervous. I warned him about the first feeling of time travel, how it would seem like he were falling. I then began to describe to him the things that he would see, but he interrupted me. "I don't really care about all of that. We're wasting valuable time. Just start the machine, please." I did not like being spoken to in such a way, but I assumed that it was his nervousness that caused him to be so impatient. I started the machine, and immediately the lights on the dials turned on. Then, taking hold of the past lever, I pushed it forward a few inches. The machine suddenly started racing very quickly into the past. Every second we traveled at least 2 years. It was moving too fast for me to control very accurately. I tried pulling the lever back a little, but the machine did not slow down. How was I to stop the machine at exactly 94 years in the past when I could not see the change in years very clearly? I would have to guess and then stop the machine very suddenly. This would certainly throw both Elsner and me violently from the machine. For just a second I looked over at my companion to see how he was doing. He had thrown up all over himself and then fainted. I thought to myself that this might be for the best, since he could not know or fear what was to come. The machine was going faster and faster through time. I could only see the first 3 numbers on the dial. They read 303. The 4th number was simply moving too quickly now. I decided that as soon as the 3rd number changed to 0, I would pull back the lever. That moment arrived only 2 seconds later. I immediately pulled the lever back as hard as I could and was happy to find myself still seated in the machine when it stopped. I had forgotten about the straps that had been added to the seat to hold us in. The sudden stop awakened Elsner. He looked terribly confused. "Is that it? Have we arrived already?" he asked. I had forgotten to look at the dial to see how close we had come to the year 2994. "It looks as though we are 2 years earlier than we had planned," I said. "The dial says we're in the year 2992. "It doesn't matter, as long as it is before his birth and his parents are still living in this area. We can still carry out our mission," said Elsner. Looking around us, it appeared that we were in a forested area. I asked Elsner how far he thought we were from the edge of the city now. "We are still very near. Less than a mile, I would say." Then, seeing the vomit all over his clothing, "Goodness, what happened here?" "Yes, sorry about that, but there seems to be something wrong with the machine. I could not control the speed of our travel. I'm afraid you became quite ill." "Well, I guess I'll have to change. Excuse me." Elsner then climbed out of the machine, taking the 2 small bags with him, went behind a large oak tree. I took the opportunity to look over the machine and tried to find out exactly what was wrong. "Can you fix it?" asked Elsner, coming out from behind the tree, wearing a new pair of pants and buttoning up a black shirt. "Yes, but I'll need to remove part of the engine. We'll have to find some tools." "Fine. Let's move the machine over behind that row of trees. It will be harder for people to see there. We can look for tools in the city." Elsner seemed familiar with the woods we were in, for after hiding the machine, he did not take a moment to think about which direction would lead us to the city. He simply started walking. Catching up to him, I asked, "How do you know the way?" "I used to play in these woods when I was a child. My friends and I would ride our bicycles out here at 6 in the morning and catch fish in a pond just on the other side of that hill over there." We walked for about 15 minutes until we came upon a cement path with a line down the center. It ran through the forest for what seemed like miles. I put my hand to the ground and found that it was vibrating. Then Elsner grabbed me by the back of my shirt and pulled me to where he was standing. Suddenly, there appeared a long train-like vehicle filled with people. It sped silently past us, and then, after making a quick turn through the trees, was gone out of sight. "Amazing!" I shouted. "Come, there's a station not too far from here." Soon we found ourselves in front of a large silver building through which the train seemed to travel. Elsner bought some tickets, and we boarded the next train that came along. Speeding through the city, I thought of something that upset me a great deal. "Dr. Elsner, must we go all the way to Antus to complete this mission? That could take months," I asked. "Actually, no," he answered. "The leader of Antus was born here in our country. It was a year later that he moved to Antus. In fact, he was born in this very city." I felt very relieved to hear this. I wanted to finish this so-called mission as soon as possible, for the idea of being at work again within the walls of my laboratory was an extremely comforting one. I did not care so much for the world I was in, I must admit. It was much too frightening and fast for me. And this threat of war, although wars are common enough in our own time, they hardly threaten world destruction. At least, in our day, the wars are left to the soldiers to fight. The wars of the future would make everyone a victim, men, women, and children. We got off the train 20 minutes later at a station in the center of town. The area was full of people rushing about on foot. That train seemed to be the only form of transportation they had on land. I did not see a single horse or wagon. Come to think of it, I never saw any animals while visiting that time period. Elsner suddenly stopped in the middle of the walkway and began looking through one of his bags. He then pulled out a torn-out notebook page, which had what I guessed was an address written on it. He looked about the area for a few moments, and then quickly pushed the paper back into his bag and started walking through the surrounding crowd of people. I tried keeping up with him, but he was moving far too quickly, and the street was so full of people that I kept getting held back. Soon, all that I could see of him was his black collar among the bright red, yellow, and green of the crowd. I wanted to shout for him to stop and wait, but he was too far to hear me, and I did not feel like calling attention to him or myself. Eventually, I made it through the street crowd and found myself in a narrow alleyway. Elsner was nowhere to be found. I called out his name as quietly as I could, but no response ever came. Then something happened that nearly caused me to faint. A woman walked past me, She was fairly short and very, very thin, her beautiful yellow hair brightly reflecting the intense sunlight. She was wearing a long, flowing purple dress. I could not take my eyes from her. I felt that I knew her and suddenly had the strong urge to call to her. I did not know what to say, so I just yelled the first thing that came into my mind. "Weena!" She stopped and turned to look at me. Her face was nothing like Weena's. I was about to say sorry to her and that I had made a mistake, when suddenly the woman fell hard to the ground. I ran over to her and found blood running from her mouth and ears. She was dead. Everything after that happened so quickly. It is difficult for me to remember it clearly enough to share it with you in detail. What I do remember is Elsner then calling to me from behind. "Let's go. Our work is done." I was too surprised to say anything to him. I felt as though I had been tricked somehow. He had promised not to kill. He had said that it was just a matter of a little poison to prevent her from having children. I felt terrible. I had let another Weena die. I said nothing to Elsner the entire way back to the machine, nor did he speak to me. However, he seemed a little relieved and calmer than before. We arrived back at the forest just as the sun was beginning to set, so it was much more difficult to see one's way through the trees. Yet this did not seem to prevent Elsner from easily finding our hiding place. We removed all of the leaves and tree branches that we had used to cover the machine and put it back into the place we had originally arrived in. Within just a few minutes, we were back in his time. However, the room we landed in was not the glass one designed to catch me. It was an empty office. We both got out of the machine and stood there in the dark silence for several minutes. Out the window, the sky seemed a dark reddish-purple color. Elsner ran to the window to have a look. He seemed worried about the results of his work. I walked to a window on the other side from his and looked out. There, all around us, lay a large city, full of people just as before. The only difference was that there were no surrounding trees, and that high up into the sky, words of light seemed to hang over the city in a deep dark red. I, of course, could not read the words, so I asked Elsner to translate. He did not say anything for a few moments. Finally, when I started walking away from the window, he said to me in a very low and weak voice, "It says, Ekton City, the second capital of Antusia." I did not bother to say anything to him. I let him stand there at the window, looking pitiful, and proceeded toward the machine. I wanted nothing to do with him or his time any longer. Nothing at all. I took off the clothes he had given me and changed back into my torn and dirty old rags. Then, without saying a word, I climbed into the machine, set the dial to our year, and watched Elsner disappear with the rest of the future. Chapter 14. Steel buildings rose and fell, making way for the more modest structures of our time. Soon the laboratory walls built up again around me. I saw my house cleaner, Mrs. Watchett, again enter the room, but this time walking backwards. Then I stopped the machine and found myself once more in the laboratory among my tools and glass containers. For several minutes I did not move from my seat. So overwhelmed was I with all that I had just seen and experienced. A sadness had grown in me, for I now knew the terrible fate of mankind. I knew what a lonely place the world would once again become. And, of course, I missed Weena. I got out of the machine and, still quite unclear in my brain, began to wander around the laboratory. I thought of how that room of windows would some day replace my home, and how the Birdman statue would then be built right where the door from my laboratory to the hallway is. I looked out my window and imagined the sea one day replacing all of the surrounding buildings. I looked at the people walking about the streets and struggled with the idea that they would one day be reduced to the pitiful beings that were the Eloi and Morlocks. I then felt an overpowering sense of helplessness and began to cry. After several minutes, I regained my composure and walked painfully to the hallway, for my feet were still in horrible condition. On one of the tables, just outside the dining room, I saw a newspaper with today's date on it, and behind me ticked the clock on the wall, which read 10 minutes to 8 o'clock. Then I could hear your voices and the sounds of forks and plates. I was not sure if I was ready to face you all. I was feeling very tired and ill, but then I smelled meat and had to enter the room to see it with my own eyes. And everything else after that moment, you know yourselves. Believe me, I know how crazy all of this sounds, the scientist continued. I am surprised to be here in this room telling you such strange stories, but upon my word, they are absolutely true. Looking at the doctor, the scientist laughed a little to himself, saying, "Of course, you won't believe a word of it. Well, fine. Go ahead and assume that I've just told you a story. And so, tell me, what did you think of my story?" The doctor, feeling a little nervous about having to express the first opinion of the group, emptied his pipe into a dish on the table next to him, and seemed to be thinking about the best way to answer the scientist. Throughout this moment of silence, the sound of people moving uncomfortably about in their chairs could be heard. I looked around at the other men in the room to try and guess what they were thinking about. The editor was trying to look unimpressed, sitting back in his chair with his legs crossed. The journalist was not doing as good a job at this, however, for he could not seem to sit still as he tried out many different sitting positions. Everyone else seemed to be waiting for the doctor's response. The editor then broke the silence by getting to his feet and saying, "Well, for my part, I would recommend that you hang up your lab coat and seriously consider a career in story writing." Placing his hand on the scientist's shoulder, "You certainly had my attention from beginning to end." "So, you doubt the truth of it?" "Well, you must understand—" "Of course, you doubt it." Then, turning to the others, the scientist asked, "Does anyone have a match?" Puffing away at a pipe he had just stuffed full of tobacco, he relaxed further into his chair. I don't know. Maybe it was all just a dream of some kind. But somehow I can't—" At this moment he was looking down at his poor feet and shaking his head. The doctor then walked over to the table where the flowers from the scientist's pocket lay. He looked at them closely. "I can't say that I recognize this particular kind of flower." "Good Lord!" cried the journalist. "Look at the time. It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning. My wife will kill me." "Which way are you going?" asked the psychologist. "Maybe we can share a cab." "Excuse me, but may I take these flowers with me?" asked the doctor. "I would like to take a closer look at them." "I'm sorry, but you may not," answered the scientist. "Well, at least tell me where you found them." At this, the scientist's eyes became a little teary. He looked down for a moment and ran his right arm across his face. I told you before. Weena put them into my pocket. He seemed to be struggling with the memory. I don't know. Am I lying to myself? Is there really any time machine? I must go and see. He then jumped from his chair and ran out into the hallway, down to where his laboratory stood. We all followed close behind. The machine was indeed there. I noticed on the bottom some mud and grass stuck to the metal. Parts of the machine's exterior seemed to be slightly damaged. The scientist, feeling the damaged area of the machine, smiled and, as if relieved, said, "Ah, yes, it is true after all." Then, turning back to us, "Gentlemen, I am grateful for your time this evening. Now, if you will excuse me, I must be getting to bed." He took us back out into the hall and helped us with our coats. "You really ought to consider taking a break from your work," suggested the doctor. "A few weeks might do you some good." This caused the scientist to laugh quite loudly, and he was still laughing as we all pulled away from his home in our different cabs. Of course, everyone there had no doubt that what we had been told that night was a complete lie. I, however, could not make up my mind about it. Even though the story itself was unbelievable, the way that it had been told by the scientist, full of what seemed to be real emotion and excitement, impressed me greatly. That whole night I lay in bed without sleeping. I decided the following day to pay him a second visit. When I arrived at his home, I was told that he could be found in his laboratory. However, when I entered, he was not there. I did see the time machine, though, in its corner, and I examined it very closely. Under my hand, it seemed almost too easy to break. A few minutes later, I returned to the hallway, where I then ran into the scientist, who seemed to be busy making preparations of some sort. In his hands, he carried a camera and a travel bag. He smiled at me, appearing happy that I had come by. "I'm sorry, I'm so terribly busy." "So all of this is really true? You really can travel through time?" "Absolutely." The smile left his face for just a moment when he said this. Then, as if awakening from some other thought, he checked the contents of his bag. "I'm very thankful that you came back to see me today. I would be happy to sit down to tea with you and chat, if you will just give me a half-hour or so to do a bit of work." "Of course. Please don't let me stop you. I'll just wait in here and read the paper." And with that, he left the room. Sitting myself down in what I thought looked like the most comfortable chair, I began to look through that morning's paper. I wondered what he could possibly do in only 30 minutes' time. Then, catching sight of an advertisement in the paper, I suddenly remembered that I had a business appointment in little over an hour. I knew that I would have to leave immediately if I were to arrive there on time. Setting down the paper, I quickly walked down the hall to the laboratory. Upon entering, I was hit with a gust of wind, and rounding the doorway, I thought that I had caught a glimpse of what seemed to be a ghost-like figure which disappeared just seconds later. Thinking that my eyes were playing games with me, I rubbed them and looked once again. The scientist was nowhere to be seen, and the time machine was gone as well. Just then the door to the garden, the only other entrance into the laboratory, opened, and in came the housekeeper, Mr. Wright. I asked him if he had seen the scientist come through the garden. He said that he had not, and that he had come looking for the scientist as well, assuming he would be in his workroom. And at that moment, I understood what had happened. I decided not to show for my business appointment and waited in the smoking room for the scientist to return from his travels with what I hoped would be more exciting adventures to share. However, that was 3 years ago. No one has seen him since.